Hello, this is Dr. Dave Maslach talking to you about reciprocity.com. The E is written with a three. And in this particular video, I'm going to talk about whether a PhD is actually better than a master's degree. So if you don't know me, I'm a professor of innovation strategy and entrepreneurship, and I created this whole reciprocity project to give back as much as I possibly can. There were so many people that helped me out to get through graduate school and then to get my PhD that I wanted to pay the favor forward and help out other people around the world. So I created this sharing economy proofreading platform where you can get feedback on your work. And I'm doing these YouTube videos to help you as much as I possibly can. So, is a PhD actually better than a master's degree? I would think it really depends on what your particular question is. And if you follow along until the very end, I might give a little bit of insight on that. But really, the question probably should be, is it different? And how is it actually different than the PhD? Does it actually make sense that the PhD works for you or the master's works for you? So there's some definite differences between them in terms of how they feel and what you actually get accomplished out of them. The obvious ones that everybody talks about. Master's degree is much shorter. It's 1 to 2 years. A PhD is going to be anywhere between 3 to 7, 3 to 8 years, depending on what particular school you're at. The master's degree, some of them are free in terms of if you're doing more of a research-based master's. And some of them, are going to be pretty expensive. If you're doing an MBA, they're very, very expensive at some of the private institutions that we all know and have heard about. And a PhD at most places is going to be, you're going to be paid to do that, actually. You get a stipend that to do a particular thing, unless you're doing like a doctor's of business administration, for example. That's going to be a lot more. You're going to have to pay for that because it's a little bit more like an MBA kind of feel. But in general, that there is some real differences that way that are that they they're kind of obvious in a lot of different ways. But the things that really matter are sort of things that people don't really necessarily talk about. And the first thing in terms of a difference between a PhD and a master's is that a PhD is teaching you how to craft to do research, the craft of actually doing research, whereas a master's is a lot more about teaching you about the state of the art of the research that you're doing. And these are really different things because with a master's degree, you're doing much more courses. It's going to be definitely course oriented where you're going to be doing a lot of reading, and doing exams and things like that where you're learning the state of the art. It's like a step up from an undergraduate degree where you're going to spend 1 to 2 years sort of digging deeper into a particular area, and you're just probably spending a little bit more time in that particular area, whatever that might be. Whereas a PhD, it is a very much a solo endeavor, and where you are learning how to actually become a researcher in a particular area. And so you take a deep dive into one particular really tiny area of research, and you start to realize that you really don't know a lot about a lot of things around the world. And this is kind of related to the second thing I wanted to point out is that a master's degree still takes on, I feel, it takes on a very deterministic view of the world. So an undergraduate and master's degree, it really takes a sort of deterministic view of the world. So what do I mean by that is it's kind of viewing the world in a really static, non-changing way, and that is easy to measure. And part of that is because when you start doing research, you begin to realize that the world is constantly changing, that knowledge is constantly changing all the time. And it's very hard to measure anything and get a very precise sort of valid measure of something. So the world is a lot more stochastic, and it varies a lot more than what you think once you start doing research or getting a real good measure on something or putting your finger on something. Is a lot more difficult than what you think it is and you really get a grasp of that when you do a PhD of like, crafting so for example, writing a research paper has thousands of different decisions along the way. Some people call it, I think it's the the forking paths of decisions that you make along the way. And it's not clear which one that you should do when you're going through these different paths. It's never clear. And you just kind of have to make a sort of a justifiable approach when you do this. And that's a real big difference between a master's and a PhD. And it really starts generating a lot more uncertainty, a lot more ambiguity in terms of what you're going to do and what you're trying to accomplish during the PhD, compared to a master's degree. And you really should take that into consideration, because if you're not comfortable with uncertainty and not comfortable with ambiguity, then a PhD is a really challenging, for most people I know, is a really challenging career because of that, and it's not clear what you should do. The other thing, an important thing with a PhD is to note that it is very much that a PhD is very much an academic degree where you're going to be going in a particular direction, and it's training you to become an academic, right? At the end of the day, that's what it's training you to do. And if you don't, once you complete your PhD and you're done, you don't have to choose to go into academia, but the training is for academia. And so a lot of people do go into academia after that, but the default is to go into or the view is to perceive that you're going to go into academia, and then after that, if you don't go into it, there's kind of a weird sense that you didn't quite make it if you go into industry after that. I don't know why. It's kind of built into the system. Versus if you do a master's and you complete there and you want to go into industry, it's completely acceptable. In fact, it's probably encouraged, and most institutions, most schools are going to encourage you to find industry jobs at that moment and give you sort of different resources. Whereas a PhD, they don't have the same resources in terms of finding industry jobs and things like that. Like if you went to a career center, for example, they're really not at a university. They're really not going to be very helpful for that kind of stuff, because it is an academic degree and they're geared towards getting you an academic job. And so that if that's what you're thinking of doing, and I know some fields it's somewhat common, right? If you're in engineering, my undergrad is in engineering. I'm now in a business school, but if you're in engineering, a lot of people go into industry after that. And there are some places, some institutions that are trying to do this. I know MyTex in Canada, which is a granting agency, is trying to encourage more people to go into industry once they do their PhD, which is a really cool program, by the way. If there's other people around the world that are thinking of doing this kind of stuff, check out the Canadian program that they have. It's MyTax, MITACS. It's a really, really cool program. And they actually get you internships and things like that during your PhD. So if you're going into industry, that would be a nice route that I would do. And by the way, I did my PhD in Canada. That's why I know that. I don't know if there's anything in the US that's equivalent at this moment, or other places in the world. There might be one in Australia, but I'm not really all that clear about that. So the other thing to think about is because the PhD is very much this, it's very much an apprentice or artistic endeavor, and it's very much being a creative, versus doing a master's is going to be a lot more sort of course based, and you're focused on, it's coming back to this world of or this idea of learning the craft of doing research. When you are actually in the thick of it, you have to apprentice with somebody. So you're apprenticing with a professor. So your advisor or your supervisor matters a lot at this stage. And whereas a master's, it matters, it does, but it doesn't matter to the same degree as with your PhD or, when you're going into the depth of doing this kind of stuff. So I would highly recommend that you take a good deep look into the supervisor that you might be working with. It does matter a tremendous amount in terms of what's going to happen, your sort of research productivity going forward, and the sort of prediction of what you're going to do going forward. So take your time to find the person that you want to work with at the beginning. I actually have a video. If you look at my channel, you can go through and find that video. And about selecting the appropriate supervisor or advisor. And the last thing, I think this is important. So the fifth thing is very important if you're thinking of doing a PhD, or if you're thinking of doing a master's, right? It doesn't matter. But the master's, because, and I think it's really just because of probability, there's more people that have a master's degree in industry and in the world. So more people understand what it's about. So with a PhD, there's a lot less people around the world that have it. And there's a lot of confusion about what it's about and what you do during the entire process. And so the rest of the world is going to understand what a master's is a lot more in an undergrad. More people are going to understand an undergrad. A little bit less people are going to understand what a master's is. And then really not a lot of people understand what a PhD is because just not a lot of people have done it. So they don't understand what you do and what it's about. And so they're not going to place the same values and they're not going to understand it in the same way as somebody that has actually completed it or have the nuances of what it is until you actually do that PhD, until you actually get into the thick of it. So hopefully it makes sense. So I think in terms of a PhD being better than a master's, to be honest, I don't think it is in a lot of different ways because it just depends on the choice and the outcomes that you want to get. The thing is, it's different. And you are going to go into different career paths and get different outcomes if you choose a PhD versus doing a master's. So a master's is a stepping stone often to a PhD, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's better than a PhD depending on what you want to do. So if you want to go into industry and have a nice career that way, then that's the way to go, to just get a master's. I wouldn't do a PhD at that moment if that's what your career objective is. If your career objective is to go and to go into academia, maybe go into a research institute after, something like that in industry, then do a PhD. That's going to be a nice way of doing that as well. So hopefully this answers your question, and give me a thumbs up if you like it and do subscribe to the YouTube channel. All right.